Welcome back, A peeps, and we are going to continue talking about Module 5 of your textbook. We already talked a little bit about the scientific method, and now we're going to talk about description in psychological research. So what do I mean by description? I mean, what are the descriptive techniques or research methods that psychologists use? Well, first of all, when we talk about descriptive methods, we mean any research method that describes behaviors. So for example, there are three main types of descriptive techniques that psychologists use. Those are case studies, surveys, and naturalistic observation. So we're going to break down each of these. So when it comes to a case study is unique in that it is a very in-depth look at a particular case. And one of the most famous case studies in psychology you might have heard of, and it is about this man, Phineas Gage. Now let me tell you about Phineas Gage, all right? Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, and he was born in 1823. When he was working on the railroad one day, something happened that changed his life. There was an accident, and you see him in this photo holding a giant metal spike. There was an explosion that sent that metal rod, that spike, through his skull. And you can see a picture of that over here on the right. It went through his face, up through his brain, in the front part of the brain. This is what you'll learn later is called the frontal lobe, and back out through his head. Believe it or not, this guy survived, and he walked away. So he actually got up and went to a doctor. So he managed to survive this. This is incredible. And what's interesting is that psychologists studied him to figure out what that kind of traumatic brain injury does to a person. How does it affect them? How does it change their personality? And what they found was that Phineas Gage, after his accident, his personality changed significantly. He became a lot more ornery, a lot more grumpy. He just didn't seem like the same guy. In fact, his friends and family said he was never the same after that. He was a whole new person. And if you're a fan of Grey's Anatomy, you've seen that a little bit. There's a character on Grey's Anatomy that goes through a similar experience because of a brain tumor. So this is something that, a case study, you can look in depth at this unique case and you can learn a lot about the brain and about psychology. And the downside of a case study is you cannot replicate that. And when I say replication is when you can redo a study. So if we did an experiment, we can redo the experiment and see if we get the same results. And if we keep getting the same results, then it's pretty clear that we have found a scientific fact. With a case study, you cannot replicate it. It is unique. It's a one-time, once-in-a-lifetime instance. And part of the reason you can't repeat this case study and many case studies is, in this case, how am I going to get a volunteer to shove a spike through their brain? That's not going to happen. I can't do that ethically. That's questionable. And even if I could get someone to say, sure, go for it, that's still questionable. We might want to check on that person and see if they're okay. Another case study that's well known is the case of Jeannie Wiley, and some of you might have heard of this in other classes. Jeannie Wiley is a young girl, and her dad basically kept her locked up in a room for her entire childhood. And this is her room that you see pictured here. All she had was basically a cage that he locked her in every night to sleep in. The window was covered up so she couldn't see outside. She didn't interact with people during the day. And all she had was this potty chair. And there were most of the day, he would strap her to that chair and she would be stuck there all day. Very, very sad instance. And Jeannie, what we learned from Jeannie is that it's very, very important in your childhood to have nurture, to have social interaction, to have love and acceptance. And the sad case of Jeannie Wiley, she didn't learn how to communicate, how to speak. And when they finally found her and rescued her out of the situation, she was already about 12 years old. But her body looked like she was only 7. And so we realized that this kind of treatment, this kind of environment can have a significant influence on your physical development as well as your mental development. And so Psychologists jumped on the opportunity to study her because there were certain questions they couldn't ethically answer because there was no way to study this. You can't get away with doing this as a scientist because it's morally wrong. And so even though it's very sad, it was an opportunity for scientists and linguists, people who study language, to answer some questions they had that they never could have answered otherwise. So again, a case study, they studied it in depth, they worked with her for years. You can't replicate that. So to reiterate, what are the pros and cons of a case study? The pros are that you can get a really in-depth look at a certain case. You can also study questions that you wouldn't be able to study otherwise. The con is that you cannot replicate a case study. Usually it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study a particular question. Another type of descriptive technique in psychology is called surveys. You guys do surveys all the time. You did one for my class just not long ago. So surveys are probably the easiest way to conduct scientific research. They're usually done to kind of estimate how people feel about something or to see what a reported behavior, reported meaning what I say I do. So I'm reporting that I do this. You can get information from a much larger population very quickly without spending all your money on doing your research. The problem or the thing to think about when it comes to surveys is you have to be very careful about how you write a survey because you might write a question thinking that it makes perfect sense and the person that answers the question may not read it the same way you do. And I experienced this because when I was in college, my major was sociology, which overlaps with psychology a little bit. It's the other major, social science. And I had to conduct some research and I had to conduct a survey. And I realized after I started collecting the surveys and reading people's responses that they didn't understand what I was trying to ask because I didn't write my questions perfectly. And of course, they're never going to be perfect, but I could have done better. And so that was a learning experience for me. The other thing to keep in mind about a survey is that you want to get what we call a random sample. What that means is you don't want to send it only to a certain group of people that all have the same things in common. You want to get information from people of all different ages, all different cultural backgrounds, all different socioeconomic statuses. You want to get it to be as random as possible so that you get a better representation of the entire population that you're studying. So for example, if I wanted to survey MacArthur students, I'm not going to just send the survey to my AP Psychology students because you guys are a special group within the wider population of MacArthur. If I only survey AP Psychology students, well, not everybody is like y'all, you're special. So if I want a more random sample, I should just randomly get people from every grade, from all different subjects, from all different levels, AP, honors, on level, if I want to get a better picture of the whole population of MacArthur students. So that's what we want to be careful about when it comes to surveys. All right, so it's time to put this into practice a little bit. Here's what I want you to do. Grab a random piece of paper. It can be a note card. It can be a sticky note. It can be a piece of notebook paper. And I want you to number it 1 to 2. And then I'm going to have you answer 2 questions for me. All right, so go ahead and pause the video and go grab that, what you need. Okay, and we're back. So now what I want you to do is for number 1, I want you to answer this question. Is the Mississippi River longer or shorter than 500 miles? Go ahead and write that down. And for number 2, I want you to make a prediction, guess how many miles long is it? So write the actual number. How many miles long do you think the Mississippi River is? No Googling. Okay, don't cheat because that'll ruin the fun. Okay, so let's talk about why I had you do this. Now, normally, if we were in person, I would do this a little differently. I would split you into 2 groups. One group would get those questions I just asked you. The other group would get these questions. Is the Mississippi River longer or shorter than 3,000 miles? Notice that's different. In the first question, when I asked you to write it down, I said 500 miles. And then the second question is the same. Now, this is showing us that the way that question number 1 is written might influence the way you answer number 2. Why? Because it's doing something called framing. It's putting your brain, your mind, in a certain frame of reference by telling you 3,000 miles. Well, when I do this in person, the first group that the first question says 500 miles tends to have a smaller prediction of how many miles it is. And the second group always has a higher number of a prediction. So that shows us that the way you write questions and even the order that you write your questions in can affect the way that your respondents are going to respond to your survey. So you have to be very, very careful about how you write these. So to recap, the way one question is worded in your survey can actually prime your respondents to have certain answers to the other questions. The first question sort of establishes an anchor that people use to answer the rest of their questions. So that's something to keep in mind if you eventually get to do a survey in this field. Okay, I know you're dying to know, so here's the answer to the question, how long the Mississippi River is. So see how you did. The real answer is 2,320 miles long. So probably if you were affected by the way my first question was worded, then you had maybe a lower prediction here. Going back to what I was saying about needing to have a random sample, if you want to estimate in these jars the percentage of red versus blue marbles, which jar should you count? So think about it for a second. The left or the right? Okay, so did you choose the smaller jar or the larger jar? The smart thing to do would be to count the smaller jar. Why? Because it's just a random sample of the bigger jar. So in psychological research, let's say we want to look at MacArthur students. So the big jar is what we call our population. That's every single student at MacArthur. The smaller jar is a random sample of students. So it might be out of 3,000 students, maybe we take 100 students and we choose them at random. So we have students from every grade, from different levels of classes. We pick them at random. Then we can actually use the results from that sample, that random sample, to predict things about the population. Because it's random, we can do that, and it's usually a pretty good predictor. So if you don't have a random sample, it doesn't matter how big your sample is. You could have 1,000 MacArthur students, but if you only pick 1,000 MacArthur students only from 12th grade, if you take the whole senior class, even though that might be a bigger number than just 100 people, it's not random, so it's useless to us. We don't want that, okay? It's not random. Now, randomness is kind of a slippery idea. It's kind of hard, like we talked about before with our coin flipping, it's kind of hard to wrap our minds around. So remember, if we flip a coin 6 times, which of these sequences is more likely? Your gut might tell you to choose something like A or B, because there's an even amount of heads or tails over there. But all of them are equally likely, because that's randomness, right? We don't know what it's going to be, but all of them are equally likely. So be careful with that.